Attention everyone. Class discipline.
Good morning, children. Colgate. Colgate toothpaste.
I think it's really like Nora is this type of film that is like probably the worst piece that you can show before showing your own work. You know, because it's really like so beautiful that that really it's just hard to, you know, like put anything after. One of the reasons why I suggested this film is because I thought for me, who I have been doing work on the Afro-Latino diaspora in New York for the last 15 years, and I thought that the treatment of popular culture and expressive culture, such as dance and music, as part of everyday life, is extremely well represented in this film, and I think it is very successful in a way that you really understand the significance of gesture and sound in its everyday context, and how dance and music become not only a space of celebration, but a space of resistance, a space of memory, a space of history, right? But of course, history in this case, once you talk about embodiment and sound, has to do with the present tense. So it's not only about the past, right? It's always about history and how history is embodied and becomes the articulation or the conversation with the present. So one of the elements of this film is that Nora, in fact, is an artist who is now in New York, and another element of her choreography is that she actually is incorporating the gestures and traditions of the larger Afro-Latin diaspora. So there is a scene of the fight with the general that she's doing capoeira, that is an Afro-Brazilian practice, right? That comes from the slaves of Angola, and that was a martial art, right, that develops in Brazil during colonialism. So when the colonial authority will show up in this context, the slaves will pretend they were dancing, right? But in fact they were training to do their rebellions, and that's what like Nora is using in the fight with the colonial authority, right? That fight that she has. So there is the other section in which she's using the ending choreography, that is the gestures of Oshun, that is an Afro-Cuban deity based on the Yoruba tradition, that is a deity of beauty and fertility, right? And the color is yellow. So for me, it's very interesting that instead of just using Zimbabwe traditions, she's actually incorporating the tradition of the larger diaspora to tell her story of return and departure, right? As that for me is kind of this way of linking her experience to a larger circulation of this cipher that is the diasporic circle. So a friend of mine, Humberto Brown in New York, once told me that the only way to understand Africa, West Africa, was to understand its diaspora, right? And all the experiences of African immigrants or refugees in Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think that's like a really important understanding to really figure out what is the question of the post-colonial subject, right? Once these nations have their recent independence, really, right? Because once you start talking about these African nations or the Caribbean, you have to start talking about like young nation states, right? That are going through all this process of, like liberation. So I thought I will talk about my own projects, and one is about rumba music, which is, I don't know how many of you are familiar with, rumba is an expressive culture in Cuba that is a result of colonialism, right? Like because of the Spanish colonial trade of the different ethnic groups from Africa, right? These ethnic groups arrived to Cuba. They kind of were forced to meet each other and work together without knowing each other's languages or cultures, right? And they were also forced because of colonialism to syncretize the culture with the religious beliefs of the colonial crown. But essentially what rumba is a synthesis. If you understand or if you analyze the sound and the gestures of the music form, is a synthesis of the colonial encounter of these different ethnic groups, the Congo, the Carabalí, the Arara, right? And of course, if you think about colonialism and, in a way, Western tradition that separates secular traditions from religious practices, right? It's not a coincidence that rumba becomes the first secular Afro-Cuban practice that is supposed to be like always a celebration and a party. But once you start really analyzing the gesture and the sound, it's about also spirituality, rebellion, and all these other meta languages that are happening through the body and through sound, right? So for me, what has been really interesting about rumba is that it becomes once more the embodiment of memory. But once you think about rumba practice in New York, it changes a bit, right? Because in fact, in New York, those who are the rumberos of Central Park, which are the people that I hang around with, they are actually Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Panamanians, Colombians, right? They're all Afro-descendants, and they use rumba as this circle of like of bonding. Okay, but again, the whole question of how do you bond once you are in exile, right? Because many of them are either refugees or exiles. And they use rumba and not like bomba or other Afro-descendant traditions as a space of like bonding. And of course, for me this is very interesting because it's not like the traditional Cuban rumba, even though the format is the same and they are learning, like they are studying rumba. But in a way, rumba for many of these performers, because like this third space of resistance, because probably their experience of racism in their own countries or the national narratives that constitute Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, even Cuba are always in relationship to whiteness, right? So rumba becomes in Central Park this space of Afro-descendant celebration, even for Puerto Ricans, right, that have their own very strong bomba and plena traditions that are clearly African, or you have Dominican Republic that has all these palos that are like all the Haitian Dominican tradition. Rumba becomes like this third space of identification, and so you know, this is something I have learned in this context. So I'm gonna share a video with you. Essentially, I haven't shown this video really because the first reading of the video that I'm gonna show you is that the Jose Alberto, who is a rafter, I will explain briefly what that means, is making a critique. Or in a way, it sounds like he's making a critique of Fidel Castro, and the discourse of like liberation he's talking about may sound like an anti-communist rhetoric, right? And he's part of the Balsero or Rafter generation that came in 1994 to the United States as the result of the collapse of the Soviet Union and Fidel opening the shores and telling people, if you want to leave, you leave. So 120,000 people left, and the U.S. government took them into the Guantanamo base, right, where all the Al-Qaeda people were, right? And but I think that that's like a possible reading, but it's a bit like one level reading. I think that once you contextualize the Cuban experience of Afro-descendants within a larger economic system and racial system within Cuba prior to the revolution, right? And the marginalization that still has a presence in contemporary Cuba with all its troubles and all its setbacks, right? And once you situate this migration as not only political but also economic, or part of a larger history of the diaspora, right? That I think that's probably a more complicated reading of what he's doing. So I don't know. Essentially, the video is about that journey, and he is just making a distinction between himself, that is a rafter, that is the generation of Cubans that came in '94, and most of them are Afro-descendant, or yes, the first generation of Cubans who actually grew up with the revolution, which is very important. There was a prior migration called El Mariel Exodus, which was a generation of mostly young Cubans, which was also very working class, a very high percentage of Afro-descendants, and a high percentage of queer people, right? And that exodus is more complicated because it was more like sexual dissidents, working class people who just wanted also to live at the peak of the success of the revolution. So they were highly ostracized, and they were seen as anti-revolutionary, okay? These two generations of migrants is very different from earlier Cuban migrations prior or right after the revolution, which were mostly upper class, had upper mobility, had businesses in the United States, were constantly back and forth, were mostly white, right? So of course when the Mariel arrived, there was a big shock for what is to be Cuban in the United States, right? The face, the color, the race of what was to be Cuban changed dramatically with the Mariel exodus. So the Mariel is always seen as this national bad subject for the revolution, for the Cubans in Miami, and for the left wing in Latin America, because they always were like, oh, these people are the traitors of the revolution, right? The Balseros is like a different story. They really like have not been caught into this narrative of the right wing of exiles as like just against the revolution, right? Like the Balseros, because they grew up under the revolution, they haven't assimilated into that narrative of anti-Castro. But so this is kind of the political context, and I just wanted to show you these pieces called Rhuma in Exile, and of course what is relevant is how, again, sound and movement and choreography are telling like a different story or an alternative story that has to do with a larger diaspora and discourses of freedom, right?